Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review The Midnight Meat Train. So, of course, this does have like a fairly goofy title, but eventually I would go out of my way from time to time to see this movie and to just kind of watch it because I thought this had like an interesting concept and it seemed like really simple where it's just a guy going into a train killing people and like that's simple enough, but then all of a sudden it goes into a very a darker kind of approach than just simply going and killing people and hang them upside down onto this train. It becomes that it seems that these monsters are to be served up to some kind of monstrous characters, which I'm like, okay, this movie took a very weird and bizarre turn. Um, that eventually it seems that our main character, who is to be here, who is to bizarrely be called Mahogany, is to seemingly be a character that has lived for a fairly long time, but eventually it seems has kind of like eventually been a person who is to be kind of past his time, and there needs to eventually be a new uh, guy who is to basically come up in the ranks of being the new Midnight Meat Train killer guy. So it seems like this movie is quite interesting because we end up having Leon, who is to eventually just start taking photos for this job, and then all of a sudden he ends up eventually being tied to this case, and then he is just so consumed by it that he just can't go back to doing seemingly anything else. Like he just has to focus on this case, solve it, and figure it out on his own. Because it seems like if he's to go with anybody else about this, it seems like everybody in the brother is trying to avoid solving this case or going into this case because really they just don't believe anything that either Leon or Maya is to be saying. Maya or Maya? Maya? Maya is with a U, I think. So Maya? That May? I, I think I'm just going to call her Maya. And if it's ill pronounced, it's ill pronounced. So eventually it seems that Leon, who is Bradley Cooper's character, is to eventually go in and just kind of take pictures of seemingly day to day stuff. He ends up going and following a woman that ends up going missing, and coincidentally, the last time that Leon had seen this woman was on this train, and so all of a sudden, Leon is to just kind of like hang around this train station, eventually finding out there's a man consistently leaving this train seemingly every day. And all of a sudden, Leon is to follow this man to eventually have this man all of a sudden realize he's being followed and he doesn't like that. So, all this eventually comes to a head when Leon is to eventually take a photo of this guy kind of just walking about town. And when Mahogany is to go and grab Leon, he ends up seeing this ring upon his finger, and all of a sudden he ends up looking back at that photo of the woman when he was to last see her, and the ring is right there holding this door open for this woman, who is Mahogany. So now there's kind of this like who done it kind of case. How is it that this woman is obviously had gone missing, and eventually more and more Leon goes and follows this guy like throughout his day-to-day thing, finding out that he actually is to not only have this nightlife with being a person who kills people on trains, but then also is this butcher. So it's like, okay, like, so you can kind of understand why he has the weaponry he has, I guess from his day job. So So I think with that said, that's kind of like teeing it up and kind of pretty much kind of going from scene to scene and kind of talking a little bit about this, but eventually there'll be this eventually weird lead up. So with that said, yeah, let's go on into spoilers about this. So a lot of this movie is to just be scenes where, of course, Mahogany or Vinnie Jones's character is just killing people. It's a lot of that. Like it's a lot of just scenes, mostly that. But like we end up getting an actually really interesting scene between both Mahogany and this guy who is to be called uh, Guardian Angel in this film, or a lot of people would probably know him much more as Quentin Rampage Jackson, who, of course, UFC fighter, as well as being in movies like The A Team, or like I think I've seen him in a couple other films, um, but I mostly know him from A Team. So, uh, going on into here, let's go out of our way to say it's about that customary time yet again to go into this double five time territory because it is spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So, like, there was something about this film that kind of reminded me of other things. Like, for some bizarre reason, like this movie, like kind of reminded me of Candyman for whatever reason. The more like the either original one or kind of more recent one, because it honestly feels like the villain of the story, who's Mahogany. It seems that he has this like presence about him that like seems kind of almost like supernatural-ish. Like you won't be able to easily take this guy down, or he just has this kind of intimidating factor or creepy factor, maybe also that kind of gives him this kind of uh, way about him that is to make him this kind of like almost uh, supernaturally powered character. But anyways, let's go into spoilers. So Leon is to seemingly be a struggling photographer, and so it seems that he ends up finally having his kind of agent, who is Jargus, send him to Brooke Shields' character, which like it's kind of sad that you don't see Brooke Shields all that often anymore. Like I know that she used to do like shows and certain kind of things, but rarely you ever see Brooke Shields doing much of anything, which is kind of sad. So Brooke Shields is to be this character called Susan, who is to eventually go on and look at Leon's portfolio, and she is to look at it and just be like, well, it seems like whatever you're doing, like you're failing at what you're doing. Because Leon is to like say that he wants to like capture the city. Like that's the thing that he enjoys, is just kind of like going through the city and finding some interesting photos. And Susan is just like, well, like you're just failing at this. You're not doing this right. Because if anything, they're like the stuff that he's kind of taking like doesn't feel unique enough or doesn't feel like gripping enough, and so Leon has to approach this differently, which uh, like I was kind of almost assessing or assuming that like there is some kind of flavor of the Jake Gyllenhaal movie Nightcrawler in this, where eventually like I was expecting the first time around of watching this movie that eventually Leon uh, was to eventually be so desperate to get these perfect kind of photos that eventually he would almost try and create crime, just so that way he could eventually profit off of it. Uh, but it seemed like this story doesn't exactly go that route or that way. So, but then Leon ends up going into this whole like investigation that he ends up putting himself together, because he ends up going to this detective and kind of telling her about this, and like she's like, dude, you're grasping at straws. So because simply we end up finding out that Detective Lynn Hadley is to try to basically just shut this crime down. Like she knows about it, and so she is trying to basically prevent anybody from getting to know about this crime. Because we end up really just finding out that it seems like this detective is tied to the Midnight Meat Train killer. So, because everybody's just trying to bottleneck this whole thing off. So Leon is to eventually go out for a night because he ends up kind of shooting during the night. So eventually, the first thing that he ends up seeing is there's a gang that is going and putting a knife to a woman. And so, funny enough, I've recently been watching the show Heels, and coincidentally, one of the gang members in this scene here, I'm like, is that the guy from Heels? Like, why does he look so familiar to me? And then I had to scroll through IMDb. I'm like, oh yeah, like nice, like all right, like so I was trying to figure it out. Because I was like, why does he look so familiar? But he looked so young there. So pushing on. Um, so eventually, this gang member is to come closer and closer and closer to Leon to really just say, dude, you're gonna get stabbed. And so Leon is just like, hey man, like, so Leon just takes as many photos. And it's like, well, hey, like, it looks like you're very photogenic, but hey, like, have you ever been on a film before? And Leon points to the guy, just like, yeah, you're not gonna stab me because you're gonna freaking there's gonna be evidence of you doing this. So lucky me, right? So the gang members just eventually just ward off, and so this girl ends up eventually just being left alone. And so the girl who is to be just so happy that Leon is to basically save her life, that she ends up going and kissing him, and so he ends up following her to go uh, and find out what she does, and she ends up going onto this train, and so he takes one last photo of her before she ends up going onto the train, and we end up getting that photo of Leon kind of, or Mahogany, who ends up trying to open the door for this woman so that way she can come into the train. And so, like, that's the last thing that Leon really takes for that night. So he ends up going off and making all these photos because he personally makes all the photos himself, which I'm like, okay, that's kind of interesting because like this guy is like a dark room and everything where he can just like easily make these photos, and which I'm like, okay, that's interesting because like he can make them as big as he wants to or whichever. So like I'm like, okay, that's a good idea. So but it also kind of feels like Saw to me, like the very first Saw film where you actually have the photographer that has his own like dark room and whichever. So, so Leon is to eventually give these new photos to Susan, and she loves them, and so she's like, you know what, like I think that these photos are good enough to go into this art show, and by the time uh, that Leon is to actually do this art show, it doesn't really seem like he's like really like his heart is in the art show. It's just like he's like walking around talking to some people, but you can kind of tell he's just exhausted or tired from just kind of shooting, but or just really just following Mahogany around. So, so the very next day there is to be a news article where the girl of which that Leon had seen had gone missing, or had like I think it was just gone missing because the monsters or whatever, they end up just taking everything. So Leon is to be surprised about this article, and it also seems like this guy is to be a vegetarian because he is to, instead of eating meat, he is to basically eat like tofu burgers, I guess. So like he ends up going to this diner and he's like trying to like, hey man, could you bake this tofu burger? And the guy is like, no, like I'm not gonna put my real meat next to your tofu, your bean, whatever. And so like we end up having Leon who mentions that it's like it's tasteless and whatever, and so like the chef is like, well, all the more reason for me not to like all the more reason for me not to do this, to not have me like cook this for you because it doesn't taste good anyways. So, uh, but so let's kind of get on. Uh, let's push on. So eventually, let's kind of go on to some of the murders that end up taking place during this train, because there is like some kind of scenes during here. There is to be one point when we have Mahogany who is to eventually just kind of wake up for the day and bizarrely have these like scars upon his chest or some kind of weird markings upon his chest that he ends up like weirdly like taking a knife and just like picking them off. Like I don't know if that's some kind of disease or whatever that is, but it just looks so gross. So I don't know what it is. So uh but I guess this is just telling us that this guy is getting like too old for this kind of thing, or whichever. But there is to be one part where, of course, like we just have Mahogany that just whips his like big, huge metal hammer out, like we see here, and just starts like smashing people. Uh, we end up seeing the one girl who was to have kissed Leon. He just takes the hammer as she's like putting on music. He is to just go and take the hammer and crack her neck and kill her. There is to be some guys in business suits who are to, I guess, supposedly be Randall Cooper and some other kind of business people that are all kind of in fancy clothes, and eventually all those guys end up getting like butchered and killed. Like basically the only real weapon that this guy wields is this hammer, so everything is like big impactful hits and stuff like that, and like everything is to like be like a huge spray of blood, which I'm like, shouldn't they have come up with like a cleaner way? Like I don't know how like all this blood like at the end of this like just consistently gets clean. Like do we just have the train conductor who is actually a part of this and he is to eventually help out Mahogany at one point because he ends up shooting one of the people on the train and telling Mahogany that like he's like doing like he's not doing so well or he's not doing good work. Because eventually we have, let's get to it. So Mahogany is to eventually go and whip out his hammer once again to go and go against this guy named Guardian Angel, and Guardian Angel ends up being Rampage. So uh, all of a sudden we end up having just reasonably uh, Mahogany end up going and like swinging as per usual to try to take down uh, Guardian Angel, but doesn't quite do the job. Plus, this guy is much stronger than the average person of which that normally Mahogany would face. So one swipe doesn't really take this guy down, and all of a sudden Guardian Angel whips out this big huge knife and starts fighting off Mahogany. And so eventually what ends up happening is I think the train conductor ends up coming into here and shooting this guy and dropping him down, and like we just have the train conductor that's very disappointed, who is just called Driver evidently in the IMDb, just kind of disappointed in Mahogany's performance as of late. But the real reason why Mahogany just kind of was to not really do all that well against Rampage's character is just because he was like starting to feel sick, like he was starting to spit out blood for whatever reason. But so pushing on. So eventually, Leon is to follow Mahogany. I don't know why. That's the guy's name. I don't know why I have to say that all the time though. So Leon is to follow this guy and to eventually find out that he works at some like meat packing plant, like basically like a Rocky or something like that. So we end up understanding how eventually this guy goes and kills all these people and then hangs them upside down and then hooks their legs onto these hooks onto this bus or onto this subway train. Um, and we have often where there seems to be about roughly 5 to 6 people that I guess had been killed, but it seems that also that this guy waits to the very last bit of train to eventually go after these people. It's not like he just gets on any kind of train and then just starts killing them. Like, no, he has to wait till a specific time. So so eventually we go on here, and uh, what ends up happening is Leon is to first meet Mahogany and start taking photos of him when he ends up coming out of the train, and he's the only one that really comes out consistently. So Leon takes shots of him, eventually follows him, and then Mahogany spots him kind of following him. So he basically just braces, like pushes him off to the side and just holds on to him and looks at him. And so Leon is like, "Oh, I'm sorry, sir. Like, I just wanted a photo of you." To really just stop Leon from doing what he's doing because he just seems suspicious. Leon does. So that's when eventually Leon is to decide to put two and two together, that the photo of the ring and the photo of this guy, or the photo of the ring in the photo of this girl who was to be last seen, and when he was to see the ring of this guy, was the exact same. So Leon ends up going to the detective with this, to just say like, hey, this guy is to be the shifty guy. It seems like he's consistently leaving this train every single night, and people are always consistently seemingly going missing. So uh, Leon is to go to this detective, and the detective is just like, you have no real true evidence here. You have nothing that I could just like, if anything, like, this is like, if anything, it could be random killings, but like there's no real hard evidence to prove that this guy is killing anybody. So Leon is to continue to follow this guy, find out that he's working in a meat packing plant, and so he's kind of putting everything together, and he's like, oh, okay, so like obviously this is how this guy is easily going to be able to kill all these people, and maybe all of the meat that he ends up taking from all these human beings is like, he's carving them all up and then leaving them and mixing them in with this like meat packing thing, and nobody's the wiser. But we end up finding out that it's a much darker thing than that, that all this meat is just to be siphoned off from all these weird, bizarre monster creatures. So eventually, what ends up happening is Leon keeps following Mahogany consistently into his job, to eventually Mahogany spots this guy, and Leon ends up going and is like, oh crap, he spotted me. And then he ends up looking back, and Mahogany's right there just going like, seriously? So eventually Leon decides to run off, and Mahogany chases after him, and Leon ends up just figuring out a way to kind of conveniently like hide away to where Mahogany doesn't spot him, and so Leon ends up kind of safely getting out of here. So what ends up happening is Leon gets so wrapped up in this case, and that's all that really matters to him. Like, he's basically having nightmares at night, thinking about this whole case, like almost becoming the Midnight Meat Train guy himself, kind of killing these people and or getting killed himself, like he's having these horrible nightmares. So it eventually just gets to a point where uh, eventually Maya is to basically tell Leon, it's like, you know what, you need to stop all this. Like you are like you're going like you're concentrating way too hard on this. Just do something that makes you happy. Just do something that is just like something that isn't a risky thing. Like this has kind of consumed you. And so eventually Maya is to force like Leon to basically take pictures of her as she's undressing. And when Leon is to start doing that, all of a sudden he's just thinking of the case and like he can't think of anything else. And he starts like crying because he's emotional that like all he can think about is just this whole Midnight Meat Train case. So he's like, you know what, I'm sorry. And then she ends up walking off to just be like, God, like I can't, like, because we have a moment where Leon is to just passionately make love with his woman, but then we really just find out like probably the reason why he is so uh passionate with his woman is just because maybe like the fear of death is kind of getting him to be much more passionate with his woman that he's with. And now all of a sudden like maybe like weirdly Leon being with Maya just isn't good enough, like kind of thing, that he's just so like hooked onto this case now, and like he's getting much more out of that than being with Maya, weirdly. Or Maya, I don't know the pronunciation. So pushing on. So eventually what has to forcibly happen here is Leon eventually has to consistently follow this guy around to eventually go on the train and figure things out. So what ends up happening is that eventually Leon is to eventually be seeing what Mahogany does. Mahogany goes and strings up all these people. Once he's killed them, he hangs them upside down, and he ends up taking these plastic bags and taking all of the people's like possessions and whatever. And so Leon is taking pictures of all these things, and so Mahogany eventually goes and sees Leon doing this, and so he doesn't go and he doesn't go and kill him. What he ends up just doing is he just kind of strings him upside down for eventually the demons to come in and to scar up Bradley's chest, or Leon's chest. So eventually that's when Leon is to come home, and his wife is like, dude, we need to go to the hospital because like you are scarred up. Like this case is getting way too dangerous for you and you're going to die probably. Here's the interesting thing though. Eventually Leon is to find out that the scar that he is to have on his chest is the exact same scar that Mahogany has on his chest. So there's a whole symbol to that, weirdly. So but yeah, so it ends up that Maya is to eventually go to the police herself to want to just kind of resolve this case, to figure out a way to just say that like supposedly Leon was an eyewitness to this whole thing, and that supposedly like Mahogany has evidence for all this. And the detective is like, dude, I'm not gonna help you. Like this is not like if Leon had the photos, then we could run with something like this. But since Leon doesn't have the photos, then that's a mistake. Like he should have kept the photos with him. It's like, well, technically Mahogany was in the train with Leon, so there was no way out of this. So, so eventually we have Maya with Jargus, who ends up going to Mahogany's place because evidently Leon knows full well that he ends up consistently going to Hotel Barclay. We end up consistently seeing that in like kind of snippets of this movie. So Maya goes and breaks into this guy's apartment room to not find the photos, but she's to have a connection of every single death that has ever happened within the last 100 years within that same kind of familiar area, or just kind of like anybody that has to have gone missing or died, like could be connected with this one thing of paper. And so Maya ends up wanting to go and like take that and just be like, yeah, this is the evidence we need. But what ends up actually happening is Jargus, weird name, ends up getting left in this home, and he ends up getting strung up like everyone else is in this train later on, because Mahogany is to basically take this guy and to basically string him up already so that way he can be offered to these monsters. So now Maya is to try to figure out like, okay, how am I going to save my friend? And so she is going back to the detective, and the detective is like, I don't care what evidence you found. Like this detective is going out of her way to just be like, no, like I'm not gonna do anything for you. Like you just sound like a loon. Like, and this is also going too far. And like the funny thing is Mahogany is not wanting to press charges, but he wants the paper back that she had taken. And Maya's like, well, I didn't take the paper. Like I don't have it. So. So eventually, what happens in the end of this movie is Maya ends up going back to this train to eventually see if she can find this meat train guy and get this whole case resolved. And Leon ends up going there, not realizing Maya is going to be on this train, because Leon is going to man up and face Mahogany and just basically start weaponizing himself, like bizarrely having this like chainmail uh like God, what is the perfect apron? There we go. He's had this like chainmail like apron weirdly. He ends up going and like attaching all these like little things to kind of toss all these knives into his uh, little metal slot things, and he ends up getting this like hook to be like kind of from like the movie I Know What You Did Last Summer, like when they would have that like hook character. So Leon is to go and try to face, of course, this Mahogany, and so he ends up heading to get to this last stop of this train to eventually find that his girlfriend is also, or his girlfriend slash wife slash whatever, Maya, is to already be on the train. So he is to crazily jump onto this train and figure out some way to eventually kind of like open up this door so that we can make it into this train to try and defend Maya from getting killed. So that leads us to this big battle between both Mahogany and Leon. And so this is a pretty good brawl. This is a pretty good kind of fight. To where eventually we have like both of these characters eventually going and having their knives or their whatever eventually stabbing into any of these other bodies. And eventually, at one point, Jargus, who Maya was trying to hoist out of this thing that he was getting hooked into and couldn't, and it just made his feet bleed more. Eventually, his throat ends up getting cut, and he ends up just kind of gushing out blood and dying because he's the only one really alive out of everyone else. Like, everyone else is obviously dead, and he's still technically alive. So when we had this one spot where also like Mahogany was to take his hammer and to smash it right in between this person's like uh, uh, like right in between somebody's legs, and I was like, man, that looks hilarious. But anyways, so we end up having this spot that is really interesting, where like they kind of give it to her. Didn't like I naturally assumed that the character was to be dead, and then all of a sudden he just reappears again, which I thought was just I was like, man, this guy is like the Terminator. You can't take him down. So, because eventually they end up kind of tossing him out of the train, and like Maya ends up like doing pretty well for herself. So, uh, so eventually what ends up happening is the Mahogany ends up getting thrusted out of the train, and so all of a sudden the driver is to tell both Leon and Maya that they need to get out of the like uh, this kind of uh, part of the subway train, or otherwise they're going to get eaten too. So they should just kind of go into some other room or some other uh, part of the train. So they do so. So eventually they start to eventually just kind of head out to uh, eventually have Mahogany eventually appear out of nowhere again. And so there's just yet another fight that is to be happening here. And so what eventually happens is we have so many like skeleton bones and all these things are to be here. And so we just have Bradley, Leon's character, who's just like stabbing like Mahogany like it's nobody's brother, like taking one skeleton bone like and shoving it through this guy's neck, like stabbing him multiple times throughout his body to just try to get this guy down. So eventually what ends up happening is Mahogany only has one line throughout this whole thing, and so Mahogany ends up telling Leon welcome, because Leon is going to turn into the next Midnight Meat Train killer. That's, I guess, the tradition of it all, as if someone is going to be like the guy who kills whoever the Midnight Meat Train is, they become the Midnight Meat Train killer. So what ends up happening is the driver ends up coming out, and he is to mention how envious he is uh, of Leon's character. And so what he ends up doing is he ends up ripping out, just grabbing onto the tongue of Leon and ripping it out. And then afterwards, he ends up just cutting open Maya's chest and pulling out her heart, and she ends up dying, of course, instantly. And so the driver is to basically tell Leon that you are going to be the next in line. You're next. So all of a sudden, I guess we just end up having Leon, who is to eventually just accept that he will be this Midnight Meat Train killer. And so the detective ends up coming to him and is to kind of give him a bunch of like paperwork or something like that to eventually kind of hide the fact that they're going to try and kind of like snuff out this whole case, so that way no one knows about it and whichever. And so So the last thing that we end up seeing in this movie is eventually kind of this new Midnight Meat Train killer, and we don't know to the very end of the movie that it's, of course, Leon or Bradley doing this until he turns to the camera, and then we're like, ooh, like, hey, like, different kind of guy this time around, to just say that he's going to be forced to be this, like, so we now understand why Mahogany didn't talk before, but, uh, like, Vinnie Jones seems to be a guy that consistently does roles where he never talks. But then eventually he does movies like The Condemned, where eventually he ends up kind of having a quite a bit of lines, which is kind of interesting. Um, but a lot of times he ends up playing a lot of these quiet roles, which I thought was kind of fascinating for this movie, to eventually have this kind of very vicious killer that says nothing, um, because it's done that way, it's made that way. So, with that said, I hope I covered most of this movie. There might be some details that I skipped around about, but oh well. Like, I don't know how much interest that this movie still holds. Like, I remember when because I have reviewed this once before, and surprisingly, it did better than I could have thought it was going to do. And I think that was probably the main reason why, since it was like, well, like this is October, like it kind of works perfectly for me to do this kind of movie. And so why not revisit this movie? And like, there's some that obviously it's going to be probably a re-review, but most of this stuff is going to, or at least like there's going to be some things that I obviously either have never seen or whatever, and I want to try to get those out much more so than a repeater or whatever. So if anybody has ever seen like the other review, my original review of the Midnight Meat Train, then thank you for watching both of those. But eventually we have a much more review exclusive thing here, compared to what I was doing on that other channel, which was kind of just a random bag of whatever I wanted to do that day. Um, but I'm just kind of enjoying like a much more review exclusive channel. So that said, I'm gonna get out of here. Uh, where could you go out of your way to see this movie? Uh, like I guess I should have had that planned because I didn't. Um, I think right now I want to say that this movie is probably on a Tubi or something like that. TUBI. I've already spoiled and talked about this whole movie, but let me pause here for 1 second to at least say where you can go and watch this film. Let me pause for a second. Yeah, so it's on Tubi. TUBI. I think it's been on there for a very long time, so I think it's been a consistent thing on there. So, uh, I just wanted to mention that just in case for whatever reason. So if anybody is to eventually say like, "Hey, where is this movie at?" easily, where I can go and watch it for free, that's gonna basically be right now the second it's recording on Tubi, 2BI. So I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.